will be about women of Byblos, Adonis, and Montafoner.
Morgan, thank you very much for having us here. Now, we worked together on this paper. I started, then Piotr took over, then I took over, then he looked at it again. So we cannot split it into parts, okay? So we decided that Piotr presents, but then we'll answer questions, whomever else feels, I don't know, in safer position to answer the question.
First of all, I would like to thank Professor Rollinger for inviting us here. It's a very wonderful opportunity to share with the results of our research in such a beautiful mountainous environment. So thank you very much. And I will start now. Adonis is a character well attested in classical sources and a celebrated figure of modern comparative religion studies as the quintessential dying and rising god of the Golden Bough of Sir James George Frazer. Adonis attracted attention of some of the best Greek and Roman poets and prose writers from Sappho in the 7th century BC to Theocritus in the 1st century BC, Ovid at the turn of the eras, until Lucian in the 2nd century CE, and in this paper we intend to look as well into the evidence of the Alexander romance of Ps Callisthenes of the second half of the 1st century CE. The name of Adonis points to his non-Greek origin, generally recognized in classical literature. This paper will review briefly who was Adonis of Greek mythology and literature, then it will look into his Levantine pedigree, finally trying to look into possible association of Adonis and his worship into mountains of Lebanon. Oh. I control that. Yes. Judging by later testimonies, Hesiod, the earliest Greek author to refer to Adonis, makes him a son of the Phoenician king Phoenix and Althesiboia. A 2nd century CE mythographer Antoninus Liberalis listed Adonis as son of Theas, king of Assyria, and of Smyrna, the daughter of Theseus. Most commonly, in the version of the myth made canonical by Ovid, but known also to comedy author Plato in the late 5th century BC, Adonis is son of Kineras and his daughter Myrrha, or Smyrna, certainly the same whom named also Antoninus Liberalis. As we learn from the 1st century CE inscription from Athaleia in Pamphylia, a deceased youth is compared to Adonis, son of Kineras. The only attested role of Adonis plays in myth is that of a young shepherd and hunter, beloved of Aphrodite, with whom he is practically always associated in myth and cult, attested from at least the 7th century BC in Lesbos, as we learn from Sappho. Additional early evidence comes from 5th century BC Athens. The story has it that while on a hunting expedition, Adonis was killed by a wild boar, a wild animal, in most versions of the myth, including that conveyed by the Alexander romance, by a boar, sometimes believed to be Ares, the jealous lover of Aphrodite, in the disguise of the animal. Our sources do not furnish equivocal support for common modern interpretations of Greek Adonis as a dying and rising god, according to Frazer, common in all religions, or a god associated with the cycle of vegetation, or a solar deity, or of his death as a mythical paradigm of an act of personal atonement, to name but a few modern readings of his myth. In the Hellenistic age, the cult of Adonis spread throughout the Mediterranean. Some believe that with a Ptolemaic sponsorship, the most celebrated evidence for it being the 15th idyll of Theocritus portraying the Adonia in Alexandria. Lamenting for the deceased youth, Heros, as the essence of veneration of Adonis, which in Athens and many other places in the Greek world took the shape of an essentially private cultic event in summer, July, in which only women were involved. It was neither organized by the state nor marked in the official Athenian cultic calendar. Its part was setting up gardens of Adonis, sowing lettuce and fennel seeds, and potsherds this way, so that the plants may sprout, wither, and die fast. We have this depicted on the ostracon from Attica from the end of the 5th century. There are also some other depictions we would like to share with you that show how long-lasting the myth of Adonis was in the Greek iconography, where we have, as we saw on the first slide, from the approximately 5th century BC to 5th century CE, as it is depicted on these depictions. There is, however, a different strain of tradition presenting cult of Adonis as a communal affair. Inscriptions from Rhodes and the Rhodian Peria attest a cult association of Adonistai, celebrating together Adonia. In Cyprus and among the Cypriot diaspora, Adonis, often in association with Aphrodite, was worshipped as god, not as hero. This, of course, reminds us that in the Eastern context, Adonis is a companion, paredros, of Astarte Atargatis, for example, of Aphrodite to the Greeks. And here we have a map of all places that, maybe not all, but the selection of places that the cult of Adonis is attested in dedications or other kind of sources that attest cult or festivals in honor to Adonis. The most prominent literary conveyors of the Eastern tradition are Lucian's De Assyria. Also do have this map also is, as we see, the most western place we have is Behater in modern Tunisia, while the eastern fringe of this cult is Dura Europos. And this is attested in the epigraphic evidence, where we have a dedication to Adonis from Dura Europos, and the epitaph of a priest of Adonis, which comes from Behater in Tunisia. The most prominent literary conveyors of the Eastern tradition are Lucian's De Assyria and Ps Callisthenes' Alexander romance, two pieces of narrative penned by authors imbued in pre-Greek traditions of the Levant. We agree with those scholars who accept the traditional attribution of De Assyria as the work of Lucian, who introduced himself as an Assyrian and an eyewitness to holidays he describes. And we believe that the Alexander romance was created in its final version, called Recensio Alpha, by an author living in Alexandria in approximately mid-3rd century CE, a Greek or a Hellenized Egyptian. Lucian says that the temple of Aphrodite in Byblos is the place of worship of cult of Adonis, and that Biblians assert truthfulness of the story of Adonis being mortally wounded by a wild boar, and state their countryside as the scene of the event. In Byblos, it was a 2-day ceremony, the first day of which was devoted to lamenting dead Adonis, first at homes and then in public, while the resurrected god was celebrated on the second day. The Egyptian Logos of Alexander romance introduced the story of Adonis and Aphrodite while relating the fictional story of the birth of Alexander. Nectanebo, the exiled king of Egypt, an astrologer, warns Olympias, the mother of Alexander, not to deliver her baby under baleful signs of zodiac, one of which predicted, "For Aphrodite, goddess of marriage, mother of Eros the bowman, will lose Adonis the hunter. The one born in this hour, when he sees the light, arouses the wailing of the women of Byblos for himself." Although the text is cryptic, it quite obviously refers to the story, well known to the readers of the Alexander romance, of Adonis and loud celebrations of his death by women of Byblos. Lucian says that women of Byblos were expected to shave their heads on the occasion, and those who did not want to do this had to engage in sacred prostitution for 1 day. This is perhaps an example of rites of fasting and sexual orgy, attested at funerals in the ancient Near East and North Africa as almost obligatory for young women. A reflection of these practices is a Greek myth of which sisters of Adonis were credited with giving origin to prostitution. As we learn from Ps Callisthenes, the celebration of Adonia in Byblos by women, referred as an orgia, were notoriously noisy. The greatest importance of these two sources, independent of each other, is that they indicate that Byblos was the cult center of Adonis. It is generally believed that Adonis, although never attested directly in Eastern written sources, is a Phoenician deity and a home in Phoenicia, Syria, and Cyprus. Ammianus Marcellinus shows that Adonis was still venerated in late antique Antioch, while mourning of Tammuz, whom he was juxtaposed or even assimilated is attested in Harran well into Muslim Middle Ages. The name Adonis is derived either from the Western Semitic Adon, with a Greek ending iota sigma, or Adoni, my lord, with a Greek ending sigma. The title or epithet Adon is attested in a tablet from Ras Shamra, Ugarit, of the 13th century BC, for the main god of Ugarit, Baal, a ready analogy being Adonai as the epithet pronounced by pious Jews instead of the god's name Yahweh. The memory of the Semitic origin of the name Adonis survives in lexicon of Hesychius, Adonis despotas hypophoinikon kai bolu onoma, estide kai kyrion, which translates Adonis, ruler among Phoenicians, and the name of Bolos. It also means lordly, with Bolos as a corrupt name of Baal. Thus, Adonis of Greek mythology undoubtedly follows upon the Ugaritic myth of Catabasis of Baal. A dying, youthful god is a well-known feature of Semitic religions, with the prime example of Babylonian Tammuz, with whom Adonis was sometimes juxtaposed or identified. The issue which we would like to investigate in this paper is the place of the Mount Lebanon in cult and myth of Adonis. On testimony of Lucian and Ps Callisthenes, the place of worship of Adonis is the city of Byblos, where it was practiced in a large temple of Biblian Aphrodite. When Lucian certainly has in mind is the temple of Astarte or Xene Aphrodite, foreign Aphrodite, the shrine perhaps to identified with a 1st-2nd century CE temple, which occupies a part of the archaic temple of Resheth. It may well have been the structure called by Plutarch the palace of Astarte and Melkart. And we have this several pictures of Byblos just to give you the impression what is the relation between the city and the coastland and Mount Lebanon, which actually we already see in this picture. This is the temple of the obelisk, which is sometimes identified with the temple of Resheth. This is another. Then again we see the mountains. And here we have the Mount Lebanon, so from other side. It is from Heliopolis, Baalbek. Almost certainly Adonis was worshipped and lamented in Byblos in pre-Hellenistic times, but the earliest written evidence for his ties to the city is quite late. They are attested directly in the Alexandra of Lycophron and indirectly in the histories of Cleitarchus, both of the first half of the early 3rd century BC. For Strabo, who is writing in the early Roman age, Byblos is already sacred to Adonis, hieraesti to Adonidos, what shows how deeply rooted the cult was thought in that time. Perhaps due to the strong and long-lasting ties between Byblos and Egypt, Adonis in Byblos assimilated many features of Osiris, both in myth, literature, and in iconography. But there is a number of references to ex-urban part of the cult and the story of Adonis. First of all, Lucian says that mourning of Adonis took place in rural territory, Hora of Byblos, Pentha anaten horen histatai. Whoever has ever been in Jbeil in Lebanon, ancient Byblos, will immediately recognize that Hora of Byblos means Mount Lebanon, as the mountains nearly touch the sea near the city. Theodore Barconi, a late approximately 800 CE, but a reliable Syriac author, says that mourning took place on Mount Lebanon for Balti, Astarte, and Tammuz, and this surely refers to Astarte, Balad Gebal, lady of Byblos, and Adonis. Another Syriac author, Meliton, pseudo-Meliton maybe, says that it was in Lebanon that Hephaestus slew Tammuz hunting wild boars. Also, Lucian says that Adonis was wounded on Lebanon. Then there's a celebrated story of the river Adonis, now Nahr Ibrahim, related by Lucian. Each year the river grows bloody and, losing its normal flow, flows into the sea and incardinates the greater part of it, signaling the rituals of mourning to the Biblians. The story is that on these days, Adonis is wounded on Lebanon, and the blood that reaches the sea changes the color of the river and gives the stream its name. Although Lucian rationalized the myth pointing out at red soil being washed into the river by rain, he still keeps the miraculous in the timing of discoloring of the river every year on the same day. The wind timing seemed to be miraculous indeed. The phenomenon of the river Nah Ibrahim changing its color in early spring is well known to modern observers too. However, despite the literary sources in the Greco-Roman times, the cult of Adonis himself is rather poorly attested in the local evidence, which contrasts the general context of the religious life at the area of Mount Lebanon at that time. In order to realize this discrepancy, one can briefly acknowledge the wealth of the religious life of Phoenicia throughout the ages. One of these aspects is a vivid religious exchange that took place not only in the Mediterranean, but also in the Phoenician homeland itself. For centuries, Phoenician cult sites were a destination for foreign pilgrims. This is attested both in the case of major cult centers like Bostan es-Sheikh, the Sidonian sanctuary of Eshmun Asklepios, and in some lesser sites like Vasta, a holy grotto of Aphrodite in the coastal area between Tyre and Sidon. In both sites, we encounter foreigners dedicating votive texts to the local divinities by using their own means of expression and their own languages. In the Hellenistic period, the foreign cultic presence in the area of Mount Lebanon is also attested through the fragmentary Aramaic dedication, as depicted over here, dated according to the Seleucid era to the year 110-109 BC, once discovered in the site of Yanuch, in the range of Mount Lebanon, and often thought to be another sign of Iturian presence, known from the literary sources too. But it is the Roman times that provide us with the most material evidence certainly proving a substantial social and economic prosperity that allowed the local elites and rural communities to undertake an extensive building effort in order to develop the cultic infrastructure. Indeed, so far, in the range of Mount Lebanon and its immediate vicinity, there are approximately 33 identified sacred sites, some of them marked on this map, that can be dated to this period. Most of them are rural sanctuaries with some significant infrastructure, including a shrine or a temple. This growth, both in number and quality of local sanctuaries, seems to be a common tendency in the region and is also attested in an area of Mount Hermon in the south of Phoenicia. Unfortunately, in most cases, it is difficult to identify a cult exercised at a particular site. The preserved evidence rarely contains any specific indicator that could allow one to associate a place with a divinity. When it is the case, the indication is provided by inscriptions or iconographic representations. One of the most important cultic sites of Mount Lebanon range is the sanctuary of Kalat Fakra, which produce a number of inscriptions dedicated to Atargatis and local divinity called Zeus Belgelassos that allow us to identify the cult there. Keeping in mind both the wealth of the religious life of the region and its significant development in the Greco-Roman period, it is somehow surprising that the non-literary evidence for the cult of Adonis in Phoenicia is very limited. There are only some material signs that could possibly attest the cult. One can perhaps mention an iconographic representation of mourning Aphrodite at Kasuba near Byblos, usually associated with the mythological story of her love affair with Adonis and his tragic death. Here we have the depiction of this altar I mentioned from Kasuba, while the representation that the monument bears resembles greatly the very common depiction of Venus in the area of Phoenicia that is also attested on the coinage of particular cities, like, for example, here at Caesarea at Lebanon, a coin dated to the times of Elagabalus. In terms of the epigraphic evidence, we know of only one dedication to Adonis, very recently edited actually, most likely dated from the 2nd to 1st century CE, but of uncertain provenance. The text carved in a block of marble is highly damaged and bears only a fraction of the dedicatory formula indicating the divinity the dedication is made to, Deo Adoni, to God Adonis, with the rest of the inscription perished. What is most noteworthy is the fact that the dedication is written in Latin. This could possibly indicate, as the editor of the inscription believes, that the item comes from the area of Byblos, where Latin is most widely attested in the epigraphic evidence. On the other hand, however, we need to keep in mind that in the Roman times, Phoenicia, when compared with other regions of the Eastern Mediterranean, is a land where Latin is exceptionally well represented in the local epigraphic evidence, with almost 21% of all preserved inscriptions written in this language. Furthermore, although the Latin evidence is mainly attested in the region of Berytos and Heliopolis-Baalbek, where 2 Roman colonies for veterans of the 3rd, 5th, and 8th legions were established, the inscriptions in Latin occur in a substantial number, also in other areas of the region, usually at the major cities like Tyre or Sidon. However, the language is occasionally attested in other areas of the region, including the countryside of Beka Valley. In general, yes, I'm about to finish. In general, we can distinguish a number of types of the Latin inscriptions in Phoenicia: honorific inscriptions, epitaphs, religious dedication, and so-called inscriptions, inscription forestière. While specimens of those 3 first types of Latin inscriptions occur mainly in the aforementioned areas, the last one, a group of almost... Okay. Since there is only some time... Yes, the main conclusion is that the role of Latin in the region. Okay, but I want to. That the Latin presence of that does not exclude the possibility that this dedication could come from other areas of Phoenicia, which would be more attached to the cult of Adonis, which is Byblos, which is also there's a very strong Roman presence over there, especially in times of Hadrian. When tracing the connections between the cult of Adonis and Mount Lebanon, one has to keep in mind the mythological and cultic association between Adonis and Aphrodite, or Atargatis, whose cult is well attested in that area in a number of sites. The most important shrine of Atargatis, Aphrodite in the area, in the area, it was in Aphaka, on the slopes of Lebanon, a sanctuary known both from the literary evidence and the archaeological remains. We see here the sources of river Adonis, Nahri Ibrahim, where is Aphaka located, and here we have the ruins of the temple. Most likely it is Aphaka that should be identified with the extramural sanctuary of Byblos described by Lucian, who says that he went up from Byblos into Lebanon, a day's journey, having learned that there was an ancient temple of Aphrodite there, which Kineras had founded. One can presume that at least some rituals associated with the joint cult of Adonis and Aphrodite could take place there. Although it is not mentioned by Lucian directly, earlier on he is describing the rituals at Byblos as being held in the temple of Aphrodite, and not in the temple of Aphrodite or Adonis, etc. Oh, pardon. We also have a number of sources that actually provide us with information about the importance of the sanctuary of Aphaka, also in the late antiquity, whereas also we have the information from Zosimus or Eusebius who described the cult over there. We have also the information that actually Tammuz was killed by the boar at the very site of Aphaka, mentioned by Pseudo-Meliton. And also there is information from Etymologicum Magnum, a Byzantine lexicon of the 12th century, says that the name Aphaka is Syrian, and it refers to the place where Aphrodite embraced Adonis for the last time, presumably just before his death. In conclusion, we would like to stress first of all the long way Adonis made, from an unnamed Phoenician god to a deity worshipped throughout the Eastern Mediterranean under the epithet turned name, and then back to his Phoenician place of origin, this time known under his Western-born name. Then we would like to point at the vagaries of ancient literary source tradition. Adonis, a pre-Greek god of Byblos, is attested best by late sources, beginning with Lucian's De Syria and of the second half of the 3rd century CE, to reappear few times in Syriac authors, all Christian, hence hostile to pagan cults, but in this case surprisingly well informed. The other regretful aspect of the sword's tradition is weakness of local epigraphic evidence, with Semitic Adonis being attested paradoxically in a Latin dedication only. This is on the one hand evidence of the reluctance of Phoenician people to inscribe for display, and on the other of the cult of Adonis attracting people from across the ethnic origins, including Roman settlers. The weight of literary evidence, being Lucian, Ps Callisthenes, Meliton, Theodor Barconi, Etymologicum Magnum, and so forth, points in the direction of Hora of Byblos in Mount Lebanon as the place of the extra-urban sanctuary where women of Byblos celebrated the second part of the festival of Adonis. The most likely identification of the temple of Aphrodite in the mountain of Lebanon, where her Paredros Adonis was celebrated, is Aphaka, even if it is, to our disappointment, does not contain any inscription which would provide us material evidence for this identification. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Now questions, comments, please.
That's us.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. Just a minor question. You were absolutely right to mention the Baalu myth from Ugarit, but I think there's one more important text from Ugarit you could mention or add to your paper, because we have also the epic of Akatu. Akatu was the son of King Dan-ilu, who was not king of Ugarit, certainly, but of a kingdom somewhere situated to the north of the Bekar. And Akatu, the crown prince, received a bow made by Kotharu Vahasisu, and the goddess Anat desired this bow, but she didn't obtain it from him. In the contrary, she was also insulted by Akatu, and then she invited Akatu to a hunting party during which he was killed by wild animals, by eagles coming from the sky. So I think this is very close to the hunting myth of Adonis.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, we have to look into it. I think this paper betrays our better knowledge of Western sources than Ugaritic, so thank you so much for pointing our attention in this direction.
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you so much for your talk. Could you develop a little bit more on the connection of the Adonis myth to the mountain? Do you think that this is, let's say, a secondary element? Because, you know, there is the site of Byblos and, of course, the impressive Lebanon mountains in the back, in the east. Or do you think there is or do we have any hint, any indication that there is an original connection of Adonis with mountainous areas? Of course, Aphaka is one of the most prominent examples, this very impressive site. This is absolutely true, but as it looks to me, it looks like being secondary, but I don't know. What do you think about it?
Yes, I thought on that, and the answer is I don't know. Because now there isn't... To my mind, there isn't anything which would indicate that Adonis is, for instance, a sky god or god who is celebrated on mountain tops. Even this Aphaka, that's not a mountain top. But on the other hand, I think that mountains is his natural hunting grounds. When you think of Byblos, really, the whole, as the Greeks would call it, Hora, or rural territory of Byblos is the mountains. And mountains is the obvious place for hunt. Why? Because lowland was obviously devoted to agriculture, and you have forests and wild animals in the mountains, especially in Mount Lebanon, in the full version, which Piotr could not read because, well, we had to skip a page. He makes a reference to a long series of Latin inscriptions, well over 100, commissioned by Hadrian in Mount Lebanon, which actually marked the borders of the imperial domain. So that's an example of protecting forest in Mount Lebanon. So the natural place for Adonis is mountains. That is, he's shown, I think, in myth exclusively in two situations. One is being companion to Aphrodite, and this, could happen anywhere. But the second is his hunting activity. So this is clearly associated with mountains, but not with mountaintops. So far, we haven't been able to find any evidence of Adonis being expressly associated with mountaintop. So he's not another Zeus.
I would like to supplement one thing, because the connection between Adonis and the Mount Lebanon, actually, although it's not directly associated with evidence, it is highly associated, I think, in the phraseology of our sources. Because it is a rather very common practice for the ancient writers, for example, to associate certain certain divinities with areas. And this, in case, that would be rather Phoenicia than Lebanon. And as we try to, maybe we didn't mark it explicitly, there is very strong connection between Adonis and Lebanon in the sources. The place the story of Adonis takes place is not Phoenicia, it's Lebanon. It is also very strongly, present in all the sources we mentioned, actually. So I think that on the phraseological ground, the connection is extremely strong. Usually for most of our authors, it would be quite sufficient just to mention that Adonis is worshipped or something happened to Adonis in Phoenicia. While here we have always the mountain that is, let's say the background of this story.
So Mount Lebanon, Lebanon meaning Mount Lebanon, not modern country of Lebanon.
Of course.
So seen through this lens, it becomes very interesting, because obviously it's not the summit, it's not the top of the mountain, but it's much more being a god of the outside, being of the god of the beyond. And that's, and in that very specific case, of course, it's, let's say, somehow the slopes of the Lebanon, where the game is living, and that way it becomes a special place. Now, that's very, very interesting, actually.
If I may continue upon that, indeed, yes, that's precisely as you said, that in landscape terms, yes, that's very much on the outside. But when you look also figuratively at Adonis, well, he's best known in the Greek world as Athens. Yes, he's in a way outside of polis, because it's his holiday, quite important as it is not marked in the civic calendar. So he's not a god of the polis, as all other gods were. So he's sort of outside of the regular polis life.
I also would like to supplement concerning your question, your comment. Of course, Aphaka, if it is properly identified with a place where Adonis could be, worshipped and so on, although it is on the slopes of the Mount Lebanon and not on the top of the mountain, which is actually very difficult to build anything over there. We know that, but actually some of our sources would not agree with us. Aphaka is described, for example, in the late texts like Zosimus or I cannot recall.
Meliton.
Yes, Middleton is a very top of very very high mountain. So even though it's not located on the top, just to underline the importance of this place, it is in the literary text, associated with the very top of the mountain. So that's
But that's not true, of course, because that's one, you really wouldn't climb in one day from Byblos to the top of Mount Lebanon if you are a town gentleman, as Lucian were.
Okay, thank you. Next, questions, comments. We still have a few minutes.
You only mentioned in passing shortly a connection between Adonis and Osiris. Is it only because they have similar traits, or are there sources for cultic connections, perhaps?
Now, I would have to look through my footnotes, but I borrowed it from someone. But it's basically it's certainly not an important feature. Okay, it's important in this sense that there is on the face of it, there is a lot of similarity. You know, dying god who later becomes an important god, of course, Osiris is the best known example. And Byblos was probably the place, you correct me, Piotr, if I'm wrong, but Byblos was probably the place in which the Egyptian influence was most visible through ages. Even now, when you see this famous gallery of this sarcophagi now kept in the basement of the National Museum in Beirut, you see how much the Egyptian art influenced Byblos. So this multifarious influence, also in the area of religion. So, as I say, I just took it from someone that there is a similarity of importance of this god who died, was actually dismembered, and later on is an important local god.
Thank you. Questions, comments? Okay, so thank you very much. And I think we have half an hour break. So see you in a half a, yeah. Thank you.